Hey everybody. Uh, just wanted to introduce myself, Chris Lim, Executive Director with Contra Resource Conservation District, and I'll be presenting with Trevor. Trevor wants to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Rice. I'm an outdoor recreation planner with the National Park Service. I work with 4 of our national park sites in Contra Costa County, Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site, John Muir National Historic Site, Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, and Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park. And 2 of those sites happen to fall within the boundaries of the Delta. So I was lucky enough to be poked, prodded, handpicked, however we want to say it, as the official park liaison for the Delta NHA. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second.
Cool. Yeah, I think Trevor is going to lead us off here.
That's right. Perfect. Thank you. Chris and I were chatting the other day about wanting to give you all a little bit more background on the advisory committee. It sounds like I'm not sure how many folks here were here when Blake Roberts gave the background presentation on the Delta NHA more broadly. So I'm going to try not to go over too much of the information that he's already provided, but in case folks aren't aware of the Delta, we're not here for that presentation. We have California's first National Heritage Area right in our backyard. So the map that you're seeing there, the blue line indicates the boundaries of the new Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area. I say new, it was established as part of the John D. Dingell Act in 2019. But we just crossed a huge milestone for the NHA, which was establishment and final approval of the management plan. Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate that. So yeah, I won't go into too much detail on that. But I did want to take a couple of minutes to talk about what is in the Delta and what is the NHA. So for folks who aren't familiar with national heritage areas, they are a special type of National Park Service designation. They obviously, the National Heritage Area program nationally is managed by the National Park Service, but national heritage areas are really special entities because they aren't managed by the National Park Service. So they're not like national parks. You can see everything that's included in that blue boundary on that map includes a whole bunch of communities out there, a whole bunch of different uses that you would never find inside of a national park. And that's what makes national heritage areas great. One, they're managed locally. So there's a local coordinating entity. In this case, that's the Delta Protection Commission. And 2, they're managed as what we call living landscapes, right? So they're not like many national parks. There's not this vision to preserve them in perpetuity in sort of one set state or an evolving state. They are managed as more of a lived in and living landscape. So it's a really interesting thing. There are, gosh, I should know the final number. If anybody happens to know, throw it in the chat or pipe up, but I think there's over 50 national heritage areas now, or it's approaching that. So yeah, they're gaining popularity throughout the country, and they're a really interesting preservation tool. So if you want to jump to the next slide, Chris, I wanted to show you another couple of maps because when folks think of the Delta, what they often think of is the map on the right-hand side. And that's sort of the traditional Delta boundaries. Whether you're involved with sort of the politics of the Delta, you might be familiar with these primary zone, secondary zone differences. And this is what folks often think of as the Delta. But the Delta National Heritage Area is special in a number of ways, many of which I just talked about, because it's a national heritage area, because it's California's first, because of what it contains, but also because of how expansive it is in comparison to the traditional Delta boundaries. So you can see the map on the right has the primary and secondary zones, which come toward the bay, come westward just past Pittsburgh. But when you compare that to the map on the left, where all of the yellow indicates the boundaries of the National Heritage Area, you can see how much further westward, how much further toward the bay the National Heritage Area boundaries stretch. And I think that that is really important because you can see, I also like this map on the left I pulled from the management plan, indicates all of the different communities that are in or around the Delta. And the Delta NHA is one of these interesting, if you want to call it a political boundary, because it indicates and allows areas that aren't maybe necessarily traditionally affiliated to work together. And so it brings some of those folks from our areas here in Contra Costa County to start working with folks all the way out in Sacramento, all the way out in Stockton, right, to come together on some of our shared goals, both for cultural historical preservation, but also for natural resource improvement work. So we can go to the next slide as well. I think I've got one more map, which is just a zoom in on Contra Costa County so folks can see where that boundary sits in our county here locally. And you can see again, all of these red dots here that are included in the boundary of the National Heritage Area. The boundary is a really funny thing. In some ways, it's important because you need a boundary to have a map, to have a place, right? And that's something we talk a lot about in development of the Delta National Heritage Area, and the Delta National Heritage Area Management Plan was improving the idea of Delta as a place. And so that's one reason that a boundary is important. But with a national heritage area, again, it's a living landscape. So in reality, oftentimes the boundary isn't that important. I only like to show these maps and mention it because the stories that I've heard from the original development of this is that really topographical lines is what was primarily used to develop the boundary in the first place. So we have a few odd things. I know John Muir is sliced right in half. The home site is part of the Delta, but actually Mount Wanda falls outside the Delta. So anyway, it's an interesting thing. You may have some sites like that. I know we partner closely with East Bay Regional Park District, and Thurgood Marshall Regional Park is kind of the same way. The boundary sort of slices right through it. So anyway, just wanted to point this out. And so now hopefully you can, from this map, know whether you personally or the place you work or the watershed you live and play in is part of the Delta National Heritage Area. So one more slide. And I think this is where I get into the meat of what I was asked to talk about. So one of the interesting and special things, I don't know, somebody might be keeping count, I'm probably up to 10 or 11 by now, about the Delta National Heritage Area is that it has an advisory committee. And Chris asked me to talk a little bit about the history of that advisory committee because it's a little bit unique in terms of advisory committees, and has a little already, for what is still essentially a brand new national heritage area, already has quite a bit of a history to it. So you can see the first date on my slide here goes all the way back to March 2019. I mentioned that that is when the National Heritage Area was established. As part of the establishment of the National Heritage Area, I mentioned this idea of a local coordinating entity, right? Because again, the National Park Service, although we run the program more broadly of National Heritage Areas nationally, we don't manage them locally. I'm really one of two National Park Service staff that are sort of assigned to assist the development of this National Heritage Area, but the Delta Protection Commission, in this case, a state agency, is designated as the local coordinating entity. National heritage areas more broadly can have a local coordinating entity that is a nonprofit, that is theoretically could be, I think it's a for-profits. And so anyway, there's lots of different ways that national heritage areas can be established and the local coordinating entity can be set up. So way back in March 2019, it was established. It took them about a year after establishment to start developing the management plan process. And that's when I got involved, was actually that March 2020 date. It's one of my rosy memories, my pre-COVID memories, is one of the last meetings I actually had was sitting outdoors at the John Muir National Historic Site at one of our picnic tables, meeting with Blake Roberts, meeting with the Point Heritage Development consultants that they had just recently brought on board who were touring the National Heritage Area, meeting all of the different partners and stakeholders that are there and talking about development of this advisory committee. So that's my first memory of the National Heritage Area was meeting with them, hearing about the development and hearing about their plans for developing a process to develop a management plan. So that was that time frame. As part of that, right as COVID was hitting, right as we had to transition everything to virtual, Point HDC worked with the Delta Protection Commission to transition to a virtual management plan development process. As part of that, they needed a management plan advisory committee. And so they wanted a diverse group of local stakeholders to help them to help provide input for development of the management plan. So you see that's the next timeline that I have there, September through November of 2020. As I'm sure you all remember, we were well into COVID at that point, and at that point, DPC was approving the advisory committee, establishing its charters, and then selecting the members. I think you can see here from the numbers that they received 22 applications from across the Delta. So they did a good job of actually starting even during this new COVID virtual era, soliciting applications. They chose 15 voting members from that, and then there were a number of additional ex officio members, one of which I was, again, as the designated park liaison to the National Heritage Area. I was designated as an ex officio member, so didn't have to worry about the responsibility of voting, didn't have to worry about those ethics clearances all the time, which is great for me. I was able to provide a lot of technical assistance, recommendations, and expertise to the process as they were moving forward. Then you can see there's this big jump, right? So November 2020 to March 2024. That's how long it took us to develop the management plan. Usually these management plans are asked to be developed, I think, within the first 2 or 3 years after establishment of an NHA. Obviously, with COVID, with the complexity of the Delta, there were a number of things. Also with the complexity of having a state agency that has to try and somehow mesh state federal years with, state fiscal years with federal fiscal years, which don't match up, state contracting processes with federal requirements, which don't match up. Anyway, so some of those complexities caused some additional delays beyond what the standard ask is. But come March 2024, we were able to finalize a draft of the management plan and basically send it through this big loop from the advisory committee to the Delta Protection Commission to the National Park Service review to Department of Interior for review, back to the Delta Protection Commission for final approval. As part of that process, one of the things that we had developed in the management plan, it's actually, I copied and pasted it right there on the screen, strategy 5.2.3, so you didn't have to go scrolling through the hundreds of pages in the management plan to find it, is that we were going to transition the management plan advisory committee to an NHA advisory committee. So I think that throughout those long years of developing the management plan, the value of this advisory committee having this diverse group of stakeholders provide input to the process was recognized. A lot of the folks that come at this committee from local citizens who just have an interest in, the Delta as a place, to local businesses, to local nonprofits, to other organizations, other agencies like myself. You have this very broad group that provides lots of different ways of looking at things and going about things, and also provides lots of different ways of getting things done. And I think that that's incredibly valuable in a national heritage area. So we very specifically made sure that all of the love and energy and expertise in the management plan advisory committee didn't just float away after the management plan was completed, right? Because that's the last thing you want. As a planner, I can tell you, you put all this love and effort and work into a plan, somebody puts it up on a shelf and then goes the opposite way, right? That's always the cliche of management plans. And in this, we wanted to do something specifically to make sure that we kept this committee, we kept those stakeholders engaged and involved. And so we transitioned it from a management plan advisory committee to just an NHA advisory committee. And so in March of 2025, the management plan received final official approval from DPC, but actually back in, I think it was November of 2024, that transition from management plan to NHA advisory committee was completed. You can see that the committee sort of shrank from 15 voting members to 12 members with alternates and 7 ex officio members. So agency involvement kind of grew, but public members kind of shrank. Alternates were specified because one of the issues that we had with the management plan advisory committee was oftentimes getting a quorum of voting members to move elements forward. So that was one of the lessons learned that we were able to modify in the transition. So otherwise, I don't think I wanted to mention one other thing, and Chris, you may have this in your following slides, but we actually are now at the point about a year in where the advisory committee is recruiting for new members and new alternates as well. So we have staggered the terms of the advisory committee as is a standard process. And so some of those terms are already coming up. And so if you are interested in becoming a part of the future of the Delta, please take a look, and I can drop the link in the chat as well.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. I knew you were the right person to ask to help. So, and just a quick shout out to Trevor and National Park Service staff for continuing to do the good work and persevering through uncertain times. So thank you for being here. Okay, let's see now. All right, so I just wanted to point out some of the current activities of the advisory committee, and maybe Trevor did a really nice job of sort of the background. I think me personally wanting to be involved, I sort of saw this committee and the advisory group as sort of trying to do something a little bit different. They're really trying to work together to conserve and preserve sort of the history and the culture and the businesses and the natural resources, and trying to combine all of those together to essentially give a voice to the Delta. For a place that is so important and special to our state, I feel it's still undervalued and still doesn't quite have the light that it needs in our circles and beyond. So trying to bring awareness to that and sort of the crunch of all of the history and the culture and the recreation and the businesses and the natural resources, trying to find a way to make that better for the future and eventually then for the state, right? So trying to do that through a couple different ways, through community engagement, supporting local heritage. These are sort of some of the pieces that Blake has really been working on, going to different fairs and openings and festivals to try to get the word out. And also speaking to the importance of partnerships, right? With the Delta Protection Commission being a small group and the advisory committee still being a small group, but the Delta being quite large, how can you leverage some of these partnerships? And also being, understanding that the time that folks have put into this management plan has already been recognized with some awards, but hopefully, and fingers crossed, there will be others on the way as well. And doing things like podcasts and going to conferences and talking about NHA, getting the word out basically, and showing up to events and having people present and understanding. And maybe this is the first time folks on this call have heard of the NHA. So still trying to get the word out about it. Really trying to, what does it look like to bring tourism to the Delta? In a place that maybe is not set up with infrastructure and the Delta Road that folks have been out there. What does it look like to try to invite folks to come out on the weekends, on day trips. And so trying to balance the tourism piece and get more folks engaged and understanding what's in the Delta. Hopefully folks visited the Visit California Delta website. It's a good one. It's a good resource. Needs a little bit of updating, but folks are working on that as well. And then the Delta Leadership Program. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. I'm actually, alumni? Year 2022, I was part of the Delta Leadership Program. It's essentially a cohort of several months and learning all sort of different issues about the Delta. And I think it's a real nice way to get folks exposed and being able to discuss the Delta and understanding the current needs and issues happening in the Delta. And part of that is developing certain projects like this Junior Rangers program or day trip itineraries. So having the cohort develop some special projects and then also, showcasing some event venues. So basically, coming up with different ideas and different projects that the Delta Protection Commission can then implement with the NHA. Okay. And so also engaging with our Native folks and really trying to think about the Delta and its importance to the history with our tribes. You know, when I'm out in the Delta, I just imagine it as a transportation highway and having the canoes out there and people getting from place to place and the importance of that. So trying to engage with folks there. There's also different task groups that have been formed, such as communications and marketing. There's a tourism group. I'm naturally part of the natural resources task group. We have yet to meet, so I'm still waiting, but other groups have met. And then also trying to get some permanent staff to help support the NHA as well. And I do want to make a quick shout out to this Delta Heritage Forum. If folks weren't able to attend this past year, it was a real nice event. It was at the Delta Historical Society Museum in Antioch. If folks have not, sorry, the Antioch Historical Museum, folks have not been able to go there, it's a pretty cool spot. And, you know, I go to a lot of sort of conferences and, seminars and things like that. But this one was a little bit different. It really highlighted storytelling. It highlighted the history of the Delta. It engaged with, they had Native folks presenting, they had folks from East Bay Parks talking about getting young people engaged. So it was a real mix of different presentations. And so I highly encourage folks to attend the next one, hopefully in early 2026. Okay. Also, if folks aren't familiar with America 250, California 175, and ANZA 250, but these are all big anniversary dates, and we'll all have large events attached to them. So the NHA is trying to figure out how to highlight the Delta with these events, how to leverage partnerships to help put on events. But these are also hopefully other ways that groups locally can market themselves in celebration of some of these anniversaries. One of the things of getting folks more exposure to the Delta is the water tour initiative. So what does it look like to get folks on the water and in a boat and touring the Delta? Here at the RCD, we really want to connect folks to their watershed. That's part of the reason why we do cleanups. That's part of the reason why we want to do field trips with students. We want to get folks a little bit wet and a little bit dirty and to understand their connection to their place. And so bringing folks on boats on the Delta and touring some of the sites and recreating and learning some of the history, I think is a real nice idea. So that task force has been meeting. and trying to figure out ways and partnering with businesses or other ways to get folks on a boat in the Delta. There's also a passport program, and this is the idea that you have sort of a booklet and you go to different sites, and for each of the sites, you collect a different stamp. Here it's real popular for other areas. And so I think this is a nice idea to, folks go around on the weekend and check out different sites. That's an excuse to go and check it out. And yeah, so this will be launching soon. There's sites all throughout the Delta. I do want to highlight some of the local partners here. So Contra Costa County Historical Society, Contra Costa County Library, East Bay Regional Parks District. And I believe there's more opportunities for folks to get involved and organizations to get involved. So if you're interested, reach out to me and Trevor, and we can pass that on to Blake. I think one of the caveats is that you have to be sort of open most days, particularly weekends, so that somebody is there to help with the stamping part. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up talking about some numbers. I don't know, maybe it has become one of my favorite things to talk about. But so in terms of funding for this program, the Delta Protection Commission last fiscal year received over $150,000. That funding is anticipated to increase, was anticipated to increase this year up to 500,000. And that's it's from a pool, right, of all the NHAs. And then because of administration at this point, some of the funding is in a precarious position, unfortunately. And so for the total country, there has been a request of 33.5 million split between all the NHAs. And part of this 500,000 that they were hoping to receive, I think part of that was also meant to be provided to other organizations in terms of grants or partnerships to be able to make some of these programs happen. But it's sort of up in the air right now because of the current budget. I'm still hopeful though, because obviously these NHAs throughout the country are both in Republican and Democrat areas. So I think we have folks from both sides wanting to see this funding continue. But the advisory committee is also in talks to figure out creative ways to try to fill the gap or come up with some other or diversify revenue for this. So thinking about that and how we could move forward to continue funding this program. And then I did want to make a quick shout out, and Trevor mentioned it as well, sort of the diversity of folks on the advisory committee. Shout out to Colin Coffey, who is on the call right now as a member. Trevor and I are ex officio members, meaning that we do not have a vote on the committee, but we are able to provide input. Another thing about the ex officio members is that our positions are not term positions. So that was sort of another piece that was attractive to me and the RCD, is that, if any of our constituents or partners had anything they wanted to voice about the Delta, we would always have sort of that seat there. And so with that, yeah, just a nice shout out to the folks involved with this, and for Trevor for the presentation and for being so engaged in this. And yeah, I really want to be able to, the NHA is actually a large part of the RCD's jurisdiction in terms of the shoreline and pieces like that. So it's another way for us to engage with community and for folks to understand the importance of the Delta.
Thank you so much for having us, and great setup hearing about the Delta Heritage Area. I'm super excited about that in the Passport program. Yeah, and an excellent overview of the Delta, so that's great. I'm Annika Ragsdale. I am a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council in our Climate Change and Environmental Justice Unit. And I'm here with Dan and Chris. If you all want to introduce yourselves real quick. Maybe Dan can go first.
Hi everyone, my name is Dan Constable. I'm a staff at the Delta Stewardship Council in what's called our ecosystem unit, and apologies in advance, my external webcam is not working today, so I'm just looking off into space, but I can see you.
Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Kwan. I'm also in the ecosystem unit with Dan. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so today we're basically going to give just an overview of the council, who we are, and Trevor and Chris talked a lot about the Delta Protection Commission. That's one of our sibling agencies, as is the Conservancy. It gets kind of complicated to have these different parties working in the same space. So we'll kind of give an overview of what we do that's distinct from those agencies, and then talk a bit about our Delta Adapts initiative and specifically our adaptation plan, which I think will be of interest to this group. And we'll spend a little bit more time focused on our ecosystem and agricultural strategies in that plan, again, because I think it's probably what you all will be most excited to hear about. So first up, who is the council? So we are a very small agency. As the name implies, we are stewards for the Delta. This is the legal boundary of the Delta that we kind of work within. As Trevor showed earlier, it's a little bit different from the National Heritage Area. This was defined by the Delta Reform Act, which also is the act that created us as an agency. And we have sort of a regulatory role, like a quasi-regulatory role. There's a Delta plan, which is the overarching strategy for the entire Delta, which has different policies and recommendations for projects proposed that would have an impact on the Delta. And so we sort of review those for consistency with the plan and support the overarching goals of protecting the Delta's ecosystems, its water supply, and its sense of place or its culture, as Trevor and Chris talked a lot about as well. So that's a big part of what we do. We also will amend the Delta plan as needed when there's new information available. Like Chris and Dan just put a ton of work into updating our ecosystem chapter of the plan. And in addition to our kind of planning regulatory role, we support best available science in the Delta. So we have a very strong scientific arm of the agency that funds research in the Delta, synthesizes research, does peer review, and basically helps to support just this big portfolio of best available science in the region. Dan, Chris, and I are from the planning unit. So what we do is more like regional planning efforts and coordination. And we led the development of our adaptation plan, which we'll get into next. So quick overview of our Delta Adapts initiative in general. It was a two-part initiative. First, we did a vulnerability assessment of the entire Delta. This focused on the climate hazards of extreme heat, flooding, drought, and wildfire, and how that will affect Delta assets, including people, places, ecosystems, agriculture, recreation, all of the above, infrastructure. So we started that process back in 2018, and the assessment was released in 2021. So that's a really great source of information if you're looking for how climate change will affect the Delta, and it had some localized information by county and city level too. So if you want to get a peek at what projected changes are for Contra Costa County, definitely take a look at that. And then also I just wanted to quickly mention that as part of the California 5th climate change assessment, which is when every 5 years or so we update our projections for the state based off of global models, updates, and do a bunch of new research and reports. The council will also be producing a new kind of Delta regional report, and we'll have some updated projections to share. So that will be coming early next year. So keep an eye out for that. And then we took the vulnerabilities that we identified in that assessment and basically developed our adaptation plan. So this is identifying regional adaptation priorities for the Delta in partnership with a lot of different parties across the region. So you don't need to absorb everything in this graphic, but this is just kind of to show all the partner input that went into looking at the vulnerabilities we identified in the first assessment and meeting with folks to identify those priority adaptation strategies. We did this through developing a stakeholder work group, which involved a lot of different academic partners, state agencies, local agencies, reclamation districts, including Contra, Costa, RCD, water agencies. So lots of different folks across the Delta region, and kind of broke into focus areas around water supply reliability, ecosystems, agriculture, and flooding to identify priority strategies for each of those areas. And I just wanted to touch a little bit more on the outreach and engagement efforts we went through to develop the plan. So we tried to have a very robust tribal engagement and community outreach effort as part of the development of this plan. So for our tribal engagement, we had pre-consultation available for tribal partners, hosted a tribal roundtable, did a listening session with our council, and as well as just had a extended tribal consultation period when the draft plan was out. And this was really helpful for us to identify like tribal priorities related to climate adaptation in the Delta. And we got some valuable feedback about how, you know, social issues and climate issues are really interrelated, and you can't address one without the other. We also learned a bit about the distinction between commercial agriculture versus traditional land stewardship, and to be very careful about not conflating the two when we talk about our adaptation strategies related to agriculture. And speaking of ag, we also met with farmers and landowners across the Delta, and we had about interviews with 35 different growers to identify what their concerns are related to climate change. Basically, the main takeaway was that they are all concerned about it, but it is not the priority factor that's like affecting their decisions. At this point, it's still very like market driven. But some of the environmental concerns that they mentioned were rising temperatures, increasing salinity, drought, and secondary effects like more invasive species. And these are all things that are related to climate change. And finally, we also identified different community events and presentations and meetings that we could join in different Delta communities, and especially highly socially vulnerable communities, communities that are more disproportionately going to be affected by climate change, and met with community-based organizations to identify more locally like specific priorities and needs. So with all that information, we developed about 20 different adaptation strategies and a series of more specific actions that can be taken to adapt to climate change across the Delta. And Dan is going to kind of walk you through what those strategies are. I'll hand it over to Dan.
Okay, thank you, Annika. So I'm going to go through some examples of our adaptation strategies. We have 4 top-level thematic areas. We'll start with flood risk reduction. But to go back to what Annika was just saying, within these, there are cross-cutting themes. For example, things like social justice, environmental justice considerations that really are embedded within all of these. So if you don't see those at a high-level strategy, it's because they're so integral. They're just within the thematic areas. The other part is that we had to address these, or we chose to address these as discrete areas because they came out as top-level vulnerabilities. But really, many of these are cross-cutting between the strategies as well. So some of the ecosystem restoration actions can reduce flood risk reduction, multi-benefit projects, and really there's examples throughout all of these. The way these slides are laid out, on the left side there are some example vulnerabilities. On the right side are strategies, and then we're not going to go into them all today in the interest of time, but under each of the strategies there's a number of actions. So how do you actually implement the strategy? How do you make this take effect in the real world? So all of these are laid out on our adaptation plan, which came out and was approved by the council this past month. If you're interested in the full list, we can share the link. If we haven't already, you can go take a look at that. We're just going to give a couple of examples here. So some of the top level examples of vulnerabilities for flood risk reduction came out as identified here. So we're going to see more frequent and intense flooding. And then another aspect is that levees are really important in the delta, especially in the central delta. The coastline of Contra Costa doesn't have a lot of levees. It's an interesting area. It's a bit unique, but flooding is certainly a consideration there as well. And so to address those, we came up with a number of strategies. Just some examples here on the right, the top one here, develop climate-informed understanding of delta flood dynamics. This is things like helping develop improved models that can better project and understand what these floods will look like in the future. And then further down the list, manage and expand upstream water storage capability. So this is things like better managing our reservoirs to balance water storage and flood risk reduction, but it can also cross-cut with ecosystem considerations, for example, restoring meadows in this era that can better act like a sponge and absorb some of that flood water, even though it's outside of the delta. All right, so if we can go to the next slide here. Our second thematic area is water supply reliability. This is a critical issue. The delta serves as sort of the hub of water in California. Some of the vulnerabilities, again, examples on the left here. So water supply is projected to decrease. Demand will increase primarily due to increased temperature, which results in more evaporation and demand. We expect to see a decrease in water quality. A lot of this is driven by salinity. So in Contra Costa, like the Rock Slough diversion point, that's subject to tidal influences, saline water from the San Joaquin coming in. And so we would expect that to increase in the future. And then just raw physical impacts, as we've seen in California in the past, and unfortunately this past week in Texas, there can be direct impacts from floodwaters as well. So levees can break, pipes can get washed out. There's all kinds of things that can happen there with the infrastructure. So some of the strategies that came out of this, one, a core issue of our council is to reduce reliance on the delta as a source of water. So exports to the Bay Area, to Southern California, to other areas that are reliant, we want to see a reduction in reliance on the delta itself over time. Some other ones that are listed there are modifying water infrastructure. So this can be things like taking, again, the example of meadow restoration. It can be non-traditional infrastructure, what you might think as nature-based solutions. It can also be hardening existing infrastructure. So if you have a treatment plant in Contra Costa that's subject to sea level rise, or if you have a water intake that's subject to other direct impacts, figuring out how to adjust that and make it more flexible to be able to adapt to future conditions. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay. Another area is ecosystem. We'll spend a little bit more time on this one, but if there are more questions, we can come back to this at the end as well. So for vulnerabilities under ecosystem, one, that there is not a lot of migration space. So especially this is an issue for tidal wetlands, that the space between where tidal wetlands are in some cases upland development or levees, as sea level increases, it pushes those upslope, and at some point they run into a barrier. They can't keep going unless we modify the landscape. And if you have houses there, you basically can't do that. It's just not feasible. And so they're extremely vulnerable to just not having space on the landscape where they can migrate. And then really the other high level of vulnerability is just across the board impacts from climate hazards, things like heat, more variable precipitation, again, sea level rise. All those come together and they affect the ability of the ecosystem to function as it has in the past. And so there's a lot of strategies under this. Just a couple examples under this. One is looking at building capacity and partnerships for ecosystem resilience. So a lot of the work we've done as a council is really around this coordination and increasing partnerships to make on-the-ground change. We have a kind of an interagency group that works on Delta issues, and under that there's a subcommittee that's focused specifically on restoration, and so bringing together state, federal agencies, other partners to work on these issues and come up with a more coordinated approach. Another just example in the Delta is looking at subsidence, so areas that are below sea level. That's sort of an existential threat in the Delta. If you don't address that in the long term, you get underwater lakes, what you can see in nearby Frank's Tract for your area. And we don't want to see that happen because it doesn't have very much ecosystem value. and it doesn't have a great outcome for water supply. It can act as a place that can bring in saline water during tides. It kind of sits there and it gets dissipated through the system. So there's a lot of risks associated with that. So just to go a little bit more into some of the actions under there, in the case of subsidence, we have a big push on looking at things like how do you re-wet the landscape? So this can be wetland restoration. This can be hybrid mosaics that are able to retain agriculture on the landscape, but shift to crops like rice that get water on the landscape and at least can slow down or halt that subsidence process. And then we've also considered some actions that look at kind of rotating land uses over time. So you have income coming in from commercial crops. You also can have rotating wetlands that we call walking wetlands sometimes, that provide even additional habitat for birds or help build up the food web for aquatic species. Okay, if we go to the next slide now. Just to dig in a little bit more on some examples under this, another area kind of under coordination is looking at regulatory burden. And so this is an area that's come up, it was raised by many partners as a key issue, is that it's just too hard and takes too long to get restoration on the landscape. And so there's a big push to try and reduce at least the regulatory aspects of this, so we can focus on the other big issues like money and space on the landscape. So there's various processes that are already ongoing. One is called cutting the green tape. This is an effort to streamline restoration, and similar to the CEQA exemption that just got passed for housing, it tries to make some easier pathways for restoration projects that meet certain requirements to have a kind of an easier glide path. There's also similar tools for restoration that tries to build on regional permitting, so you don't have to go get a permit or go through CEQA for every single project. You can tier off of existing efforts or fall under a programmatic approach. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. And then funding is another huge issue. Funding comes up, of course, because everyone can use more money. Restoration projects are very expensive, especially tidal restoration. Anything where you have to move soil around becomes unbelievably expensive. An example of a recent project, or somewhat recent project, is Lookout Slough, which was over $120 million for a 3,000-acre site, but a bit less than that is actually the wetlands. So we're talking some pretty serious money. And within that, we're trying to look at a more coordinated approach to funding. So we know where there are key needs in the system. We know various state agencies, federal agencies, local groups like the John Muir Land Trust and others are all trying to do good things. How can we better come together, identify what the priorities are, and come up with a funding approach for the Delta that's a bit more coordinated? As a side note, we don't address this under Delta Adapts, but I would argue that part of this funding issue is really a societal value or a political issue. You fund what you really, really want to do, and so there's trade-offs between other considerations. It's just acknowledging it's not as simple, we'll just get together and magically get up money together. It is a bigger question. Okay, and go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris to go over our other thematic area here, agriculture.
For agriculture, we expect in the near future to have more intense heat affecting growers and farmers, more prolonged droughts and more increased variability in precipitation, flooding, reduced chill hours affecting crop yield and quality, sea level rise, especially in the Bay, is always a big issue, and decreased water quality throughout the Bay Delta. And in addition to these vulnerabilities, we expect the market, the crop prices, labor costs to be the driving factor in how climate change is going to affect agriculture in the Delta. This would affect the economic stability of the industry, land use changes, saline soils, and subsidence, as Dan mentioned, will continue to impact land viability for Delta agriculture. And some of the strategies that we came up with to help address these issues are agro-food systems, such as promoting urban farms and family small-owned farms, and climate smart farming, such as modernizing the irrigation systems, using recirculating pumps to diversification of revenue in ag land, such as having agritourism, crop livestock systems, and converting parts of your farms to rice so you could flood it. That also benefits birds and benefits fish. And strategic land retirement is another strategy when it's no longer economically viable, finding ways of converting to wetlands from farms that may benefit wildlife and benefit carbon sequestration, carbon storage. Next slide, please. So we also worked with UC Davis grad students in the environmental policy and management graduate group, and they helped us identify climate smart agricultural practices suitable for use in the Delta. And they evaluated alternative revenue and funding streams of farmers. They spoke to many folks from all different sectors, including all the Delta RCDs, farmers and nonprofits and state agencies and academics, researchers. And they created a catalog to help farmers and landowners of adapting to climate change. And they created this catalog, which you could check out here with this QR code and this link. They cover a bunch of strategies, including transitioning to rice cultivation, as Dan mentioned earlier, cover cropping, targeted grazing, windbreaks, precision agriculture, whole orchard recycling, planting resilient crop types, and improving water use efficiency. Many of these things that we know that Contra Costa RCD also promotes. Okay, next slide, please. So we also wanted to list all these strategies that have higher prioritization. We got a lot of feedback and response from commenters requesting that we should prioritize which actions among all these 4 thematic areas should we focus on due to limited funding or limited time. And we identified 30 adaptation accelerators or actions that should be addressed first in the implementation stage of the adaptation plan. And these slides show 3 examples of accelerators for each of our 4 focus areas or thematic areas. And these actions all have 2 things in common. They need to happen now. Some actions must be implemented sooner rather than later because they have a narrow window of implementation. If the action is not started soon, it may be too late, either because the action is no longer possible or because the intended benefits cannot be realized, and that the cost of implementation will be a lot higher if we wait any longer. And another thing they have in common is these actions have widespread support. They are included in other agency plans or existing initiatives and programs and are based on the best available science. So for flood risk, we have adapting to climate change and socioeconomic indicators, providing flood risk warnings for evacuations, which is incredibly relevant now. And then for agriculture, it includes improving irrigation, as I mentioned earlier, creating and training the next generation of farmers. We heard from many farmers that most of their kids, children don't want to be farmers anymore. So having that training, providing support for that training is really crucial as soon as possible. For ecosystem, finding ways of reversing subsidence, which is a big issue in the Delta. Organic soil is oxidizing in dryland farming, so finding ways of re-wetting that land is important to maintain levee integrity and maintaining areas that can be farmable and can be reconnected for tidal ecosystems as well. Water supply reliability, as Dan mentioned, improving levees and recharging groundwater with flood managed aquifer recharge. And those are all important and something that we should do immediately. Okay, and next I'll pass it back to Annika for our next steps and implementation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So yeah, we'll just wrap up with kind of where do we go from here now that our adaptation plan is final and available, and I'll have a QR code for it in a second. So ideally, we'd like it to really help the region align on adaptation priorities and really be a framework for future actions. So as we're all kind of working on our separate projects and initiatives and programs, we can kind of have this as a guiding document for, okay, what should like the climate adaptation priorities for this restoration project be? And we would like to hope that this document will really be that, that guidance. And also highlight the need for investment in the region. There is so much that needs to be done in the Delta in terms of levee maintenance, funding for ecosystem projects, as Dan mentioned, to protect prime agricultural land, halt subsidence, and there's just currently not enough funding to do all of that. And our plan has a section on costs and benefits of adaptation that people can point to kind of as a funding need. And so I want to also highlight that as a potential resource to you all in like grant applications and the like. And some quick, just immediate next steps I just wanted to share. We're also working on an adaptation strategy dashboard, which we plan to release later this summer. So right now, you know, we have like 130 different actions in the plan. And so, you know, it's all organized by sections, so pretty easy to find those, but we wanted to make it even simpler so that if you want to just be able to sort by focus area, by type of action, by hazards addressed, we'll have a tool where you can do that very easily. And lastly, in terms of where do we go from here in implementation, we are proposing or evaluating options to develop a Delta Regional Climate Collaborative. As you may know, there are different regional climate collaboratives across the state already. There's one in the Sacramento region that we're a part of, the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. There's also BayCan and BARC, Bay Area Regional Climate Collaborative. So, but there isn't one that covers the entire Delta region. There's kind of bits and pieces are covered. And we learned that through the Delta Adapts initiative, people were kind of looking to us as sort of being that collaborative. And this network plot here just shows some work done by a UC Davis PhD student showing that when surveyed about like the types of climate adaptation initiatives, different adaptation planners in the Delta are working within. The Delta Adapts was highlighted a lot as one of the ones that folks are already participating in. So we just want to really continue that kind of momentum that we've developed through this work and kind of stand up a more formal collaborative where folks could meet to share resources, case studies, align on funding strategies like Dan was saying, and really like begin implementation of what's in our plan. So that's a lot of information we've thrown at you. Thank you so much for the time. If you want to know more, here's the link to our page with the adaptation plan and the QR code. And we're happy to answer any questions you all have.